Well, I mentioned presidential power. Judge Kavanaugh's views surrounding investigations of a sitting president are drawing renewed attention this morning. In a 2009 article in the Minnesota Law Review, Kavanaugh suggested that presidents be exempt from criminal investigations and civil suits while in office. He wrote that Congress should consider passing a law, quote, exempting a president while in office from criminal prosecution and investigation, including from questioning by criminal prosecutors or defense counsel. Kavanaugh went on to write, quote, we should not burden a sitting president with civil suits, criminal investigations, or criminal prosecutions. The president's job is difficult enough as it is. Some top Democrats seizing on that in relation to the ongoing Russia probe.
He picked the one guy who has specifically written that a president, in fact, should not be the subject of a criminal investigation, which the president is right now. So this seems to be, of all the people, the most self-serving person he could choose in order to protect himself from this criminal investigation.
He's a political animal. He has been for a big part of the formative years of his career. And so he thinks of this, I think, as, wow, we need to make sure that the United States of America stays safe by protecting the president from what? From investigation, from indictment, from prosecution. That's what troubles me about the whole picture here.
Okay, so let's be really clear here. Judge Kavanaugh, if he's going to be a scourge of liberals need to get it right. Judge Kavanaugh wrote that law review article in 2009 at the dawn of the Obama administration. So it would be the least self-serving thing for a conservative jurist to write, which I think actually speaks, given the hysteria surrounding Barack Obama's presidency, I actually think for a conservative jurist to write that actually speaks to the content of the judge's character. But Heidi, there is no doubt that Donald Trump and his people have admitted to members of the press already that they did know about this article, and it was discussed inside the White House. Make no mistake of it that this is the reason. I mean, I will make no mistake of it. Everybody else draw their own conclusion. You can narrow it down. You can boil it down. Donald Trump is the most self-serving, self-interested politician of certainly of our time that's ever been in the White House. That's why he has selected Judge Kavanaugh, because of this single 2009 article, and why he upset a lot of conservatives along the way to protect himself. The question is, will the Senate, will those questioning Kavanaugh ask him, will they really go after these line of questioning here, and also ask him if he'll recuse himself on any questions pertaining the indictment of Donald Trump, since there is a possibility that that's why he got this seat, if he gets it.
It can speak to the content of Kavanaugh's character, and it can also, at the same time, speak to Donald Trump's motivations. And that's why it will absolutely be a major line of questioning. And it may even be one of the reasons why, despite all of the impeccable credentials that we just discussed, Brett Kavanaugh was not one of the two judges who McConnell recommended Donald Trump pick, who would be easiest to get through the Senate. And if you look at the Democrats' messaging last night, they absolutely are shifting into high gear on this issue of Russia. You have a number of Democrats saying, even last night before Kavanaugh's announcement came out, that he should, in fact, recuse himself. This will be now two judges that this president will have put on the court who could potentially, in any number of scenarios, in terms of constitutional questions about whether he pardons himself, whether he fires Mueller, whether he is subpoenaed, could end in a constitutional question before this court. But look more broadly at the Democratic messaging. It's not just about Russia. The Democrats are saying, look at the paper trail here. There are a number of points of attack, whether it is the health care law, whether it is Russia, or whether it is Roe. This judge has a long paper trail. He just came into the crosshairs on the issue of abortion just last fall when it pertained to an immigrant teenager teenager who was trying to seek an abortion. His ruling was he tried to delay that. He was overruled. And in his dissent, he wrote, he bashed the decision and used some of the trigger words used by the activist anti-abortion crowd in terms of abortion on demand. So there are a number of flashpoints here that I think are going to make it hard on Democrats, but that is where you look for the first cracks as to those red state Democrats, Donnelly, Manchin, Heitkamp.
Yeah, and again, because, yeah, he is a conservative. There's no doubt he's a conservative. But he is, you know, as much of a, let's say, mainstream conservative as Merrick Garland is a mainstream, can't really call Garland a liberal, a moderate. But still, Mike, it is very intriguing that Kavanaugh wrote a 2009 article that said presidents should not be indicted and should not be tried, and that even the Trump White House, I think it was Maggie Haberman, said that the Trump White House admitted that they had seen that and had taken note of that in the process.
Even if that remains his strong view today, he would be only one of 9 on the Supreme Court. So, I mean, he could be overruled internally on the Supreme Court. It could be a 5-4 decision. But it's settled law, so I don't know what he's going to do. The Democrats have to be very careful in their approach to this guy.
They really
That's the only takeaway I feel this morning.
I mean, overkill could end up killing them.
Like, for instance, if they use...
What's Doug Jones going to do?
I think... Doug Jones will probably vote against him, but he'll probably be very respectful.
Yes.
I mean, you just can't call this guy a right-wing lunatic.
That's exactly the point. He is not dangerous in terms of his appearance, in terms of his rhetoric. His opinions certainly prove the point that this is a generational change on the court. He would be there for a minimum, I would assume, given good health and good luck, for at least 30 years.
But, Michael, still, so many people were saying the same thing about John Roberts, and John Roberts is a conservative, but John Roberts is also an institutionalist. He is somebody, unlike Donald Trump, that actually understands the Constitution, reveres the institutions in Washington, D.C., especially the Supreme Court of the United States. And I just don't know what Democrats expect if they keep losing elections. This is... Actually, they don't want to hear this, but they should probably read the op-ed that was written by the Yale professor, by the liberal Yale professor, saying, hey, name me 3 choices that a Republican president could have made that would be better than Brett Kavanaugh. Right. You can't.
Right. And that's the reality here in a nutshell. They can't. And Donald Trump has effectively put a nominee in place that boxes out all the other options. And he's a strong, prudent choice, given, as Mike noted at the beginning, the other choices that he could have put on the table as well. So that's the reality there. But I think the other thing with respect to this article, this law review article, you have to keep in mind he wrote that article based on his experience dealing with the Clinton impeachment. Right. He was very much a part of that. So he learned from that experience what it does to the presidency. So this was a reaction, a response to that. It just happens to now be in play again 9 years later. But you've got to put context here, and a law review article is not an indication of how a judge is going to rule with an actual case, because as he's noted in that article, there is no settled law here because the Congress hasn't acted.
And again, also noted to keep Democrats, again, so they don't overreach and attack him for writing this law review article. This law review article was written in 2009, Barack Obama's first year. And let me say again, go back to the time, go back to the place that actually was a less than safe subject for a conservative jurist to write at the beginning of the Obama administration.
And the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, will join us in just a little while to discuss the Democrats' strategy for the upcoming confirmation battle. There's also major headlines overseas. The president already fired off a tweet this morning aimed at NATO allies. Just hours before heading to Brussels to face them in person.
You know, I'm going to also talk to.
It's so painful.
You look at the colossal mess he's causing for America, across the world. I'm going to talk to Michael Steele more about the deal that Republicans have made with Donald Trump, which is you give us Supreme Court justices and tax cuts, and we let you do everything else. And we're going to talk about that deal. And
there are ramifications to that deal.
Is it worth it for him?
Is it worth it? He's also soon to meet with Vladimir Putin after reportedly commiserating with the Russian leader about the, quote, stupid people in American government. Meanwhile, Brexit is tearing apart the British leadership. Is the Prime Minister's job in jeopardy? You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.